everyone. Thank you so much for tuning into today's Author Talk series brought to you by the Library Speakers Consortium. The Library Speakers Consortium is a partnership of more than 450 library systems across the US, Canada, and New Zealand with the goal of making Author Talks more accessible to communities of all sizes. I am Brandon Adler, your host and moderator in conversation with all of the acclaimed authors that you will hear from throughout our series. Today, I am thrilled to be here with New York Times bestselling author Silvia Moreno-Garcia to chat about her newest book, The Seventh Veil of Salome, as well as so much more for the next hour. I know everyone is excited to get started, but before we begin, let's cover that standard housekeeping information that keeps everything running smoothly. We have compiled some questions that were pre-submitted with registration, but you can also submit questions during the entirety of the talk by clicking the questions button that's just below the live stream video. If you're already in full screen view, you can hit that escape tab so that you can minimize and see those tabs below the video. Keep in mind, there are a lot of you tuning in today, so we will get to as many questions as time allows. And don't worry, if you have to leave early for any reason, all registrants will receive a link to the recording via email in about 24 hours. Now to formally introduce our guest for today. Silvia Moreno-Garcia is the author of a number of critically acclaimed novels, including Gods of Jade and Shadow, Mexican Gothic, Velvet Was the Night, The Daughter of Doctor Moreau, and The Seventh Veil of Salome. She writes in a variety of genres, including fantasy, horror, noir, and historical. Mexican by birth, Canadian by inclination. I am sorry if I mess up these names. Cachanilla and Canuck, originally from Baja California. She now resides in Vancouver. She has an MA in Science and Technology Studies from the University of British Columbia. Welcome, Silvia. Thank you so much for being here. How are you this evening?
Hi, I'm good. Thank you.
Yes. Well, I'm excited to jump in, and so are a lot of other people. The question that I think that comes up the most, and I like to start with so we can kind of set the stage, is all about your journey to becoming a writer. And we, of course, get that question almost more than anything. And today is no different. Regina from Calgary Public Library and Faith from also Calgary Public Library is saying, what was your journey to becoming a writer? With an MA in Science and Technology Studies, can you tell us about your transition to fiction writing? And when did you know that this is what you wanted to do?
I actually got my master's degree when I was in my 30s. So I went back to school and I worked in communications for a really long time, and I wrote stories on the side. I started writing short fiction in 2006. It was a bit of a boom period for online publications. We still had a lot of print publications, but the web kind of allowed a new crop of science fiction and fantasy publications to proliferate. Everybody who could have a website or a WordPress site or a blogger site, they were seemingly opening online magazines. And so I've written over 70 short stories, and a lot of my output happened from 2006 to about 2014, more or less. And so there were so many magazines that I was just submitting stories. Also, a lot of small press, specialized anthologies. I would look for calls for anthologies and just go through them and see what was happening. And I ended up in an anthology called Cthulhu Erotica, erotic stories inspired by the Cthulhu mythos, and all kinds of weird stuff like that. Very kind of niche, specialized publications, especially in the horror arena. And then I won a contest at a certain point in time by a Canadian small literary press back east, and for a short story. The press is Exile Editions. When I met them, they talked to me. They were like, okay, so here's your check, your big check. It was one of those kind of like you get a big check and you get your picture with somebody famous. Gloria Vanderbilt was sponsoring the prize, so I got a picture with Gloria Vanderbilt at that time. And they liked my work, and they said, do you have any more stuff like that? Maybe we can do a collection together. And so I said, yeah. And so my first So my collection came out this year, and from that, I'd been working on a novel. To make a long story short, eventually I was published with my debut, Signal to Noise, with a British press in the UK. And from then on, it's been a lot of novels. And I still do some short story writing, but not as much as before. The short story kind of online boom market is not the same as it was back in my day. Um, but I got through. I think I was there in kind of like a second golden age of pulp fiction. The first golden age would have been in the early 20th century when Lovecraft and Clark Ashton Smith and all those guys were writing in magazines such as Weird Tales. And I think I got kind of like the second golden age when you had a lot of online magazines. I met a lot of people in the trenches that are now much better known. So we were all kind of coming up at the same time in the world. Stephen Graham Jones, Paul Tremblay, all those kinds of folks who were all involved in the horror scene. Um, and yeah, and so that's what I did for a really long time, just short stories before I started writing novels.
Okay. So that begs the question, and Cassandra beat me to it. Cassandra from Lawrence Public Library says, then what are the most influential writers or works of fiction that have inspired you and that kind of led you down that path?
I mean, Lovecraft is like I started reading Lovecraft when I was 11 years old, and when I went to grad school, I actually ended up doing my thesis on eugenics, women, and H.P. Lovecraft.
Yeah.
And so he followed me all the way from my teenage years until my 30s, and still nowadays, has been a huge influence. But lots of classic writers, 19th century writers, people like Edgar Allan Poe, writers like some other writers that are not associated with fantastic fiction or less associated with fantastic fiction, like Edith Wharton actually wrote several ghost stories, but she's most known for pretty dramatic works like The Age of Innocence, that kind of stuff. Henry James, who did write a lot of ghost stories, and we probably know him nowadays mostly for The Turn of the Screw, but he also wrote a lot of really good kind of realistic dramatic fiction like Washington Square. In Latin America, a lot of the writers of the kind of the mid-century, people like Carlos Fuentes, people like Mariana Castellanos, all those kinds of guys, and so a wide variety of authors, and in science fiction and fantasy, a lot of pulp authors. Aside from Lovecraft and Robert E. Howard, people like Clark Ashton Smith, and also the Jewel of Jory stories that are from. I totally forgot her name at this point in time. Sealmore, from Sealmore. Yeah. So just a really rich diet of everything and anything in my house.
So Faith is saying all your books span different genres successfully. How do you get yourself into the headspace of the genre for the book you're writing without being pulled in all directions?
I mean, these are all things that I kind of have long time love affairs with. When I wrote Untamed Shore and Velvet Was a Night, both of those are noirs. They're not exactly the same type of noir, but both of them fall in that space. And I love noirs, the classic writing of the time with like Raymond Chandler, that sort of stuff. But I also like it in film and neo noirs, where you start moving into the 60s, into the 70s, and so for me, noir is just something that I've had a steady diet since I was a kid of it. It's one of the things that I really consume quite a bit, and so it's a natural step. It's just something that I love, and the same can be said for things like Gothic fiction. I was big into Edgar Allan Poe when I was a teenager, that kind of goth phase, and I like Mary Shelley, I like Dracula, I like Carmilla, all those big classics. Did not like so much the kind of romantic Gothic that was more in vogue in the 1960s revival of Gothic fiction, and that has a lot more of I like the monsters Gothic, which is traditionally called by scholars the male Gothic, more than the female Gothic. But again, a steady diet of that all my life in film and in TV. And so these are just things that obsess me, that I naturally gravitate to, and that eventually I want to immerse myself in it for a long period of time and be in that space. But nothing, I don't think anything that I write about is something that is not kind of near and dear to me. The genres that I'm not interested in, it's just things I'm never going to touch, right?
Yeah.
But yeah, Gothics, noirs, all kinds of different subcategories of science fiction and fantasy, because there's like dystopias and sword and sorcery, all that kind of stuff. Yeah, loved it. Bread and butter, ate it up since I was a kid. We'll continue to eat it up. You know.
Well, so will we, from you especially. I read in a Q&A recently that you have an interest in dabbling in the Western genre, but haven't figured out yet how to make that happen.
Yeah, I haven't found my Western is the way I like to put it. I have a lot of kind of loose ideas about it, and eventually they will coalesce into something. But that has happened with a lot of my books. It's just thinking through through all those thoughts that are percolating. But I'm a huge fan of books like True Grit, right? I love it. That's like coming of age story and a Western. I also like Cormac McCarthy. Some people don't like him. They're like, oh, his prose is really weird and blood meridian. It's like nobody talks like that. But yeah, I love it. It's like this kind of art that we have in Latin America that is called churrigueresco, which is like Gothic upon Gothic. It's not just a carving, but there's a carving on top of the carving. It's like eating a kilo of sugar. That's what it's like to me when I read that book, Blood Meridian. It was just like, oh man, high on literature, and so I love that. I love that kind of work. And I like in film. I love all the spaghetti westerns that happened in the 1970s with Clint Eastwood, and so it's just this kind of category that I'm very interested in, and you don't see it almost anymore. I've seen the Western section shrink throughout my lifetime. There used to be like a Western section in bookstores, then it became one Western bookshelf, with just and eventually it became one shelf at the store, and now it's gone. Now there's no Western category, and I find that fascinating. I find it fascinating. Things that are out of vogue, things that are no longer kind of wanted, are the things that attract me probably the most. And so the Western is a very meaty space for me, but I just can't decide exactly what I want to do with it. But at some point, I think I will do something with it, just because it is one of those things, like Gothic fiction, like noirs, where I swim in it so much that something's going to come out of it at one point.
Well, I can't wait. Nai is asking, what inspires you to develop new work? And in particular, anything in particular that inspired your newest book, The Seventh Veil of Salome? So we can definitely transition into that. But before we do, can you tell us a bit about The Seventh Veil of Salome?
Yes, The Seventh Veil of Salome is both a 1950s Hollywood timeline about the making of a film, and this young woman, Vera Larios, who has just arrived in Hollywood. She's going to be in this huge production of The Seventh Veil of Salome, and you also see the
Am I frozen or is she frozen? Let's see. Okay. I can see you again. I don't know if I was frozen or if you were frozen. I'm sorry.
Your screen started spinning, but I don't know how this thing works.
Okay. Sorry. The last thing that we heard was about the character Vera Larios.
Yes, she's making a movie in 1950s Hollywood, and so you get to see what she's handling in that time period. And we also get the other side, which is a biblical epic, the story of Salome in ancient times.
Mm-hmm. And for Nai's question, anything in particular that inspired that newest book? What inspired the Seventh Veil of Salome?
Several things, and one of the biggest things, Strauss's opera, Salome, which is an adaptation of Oscar Wilde's play Salome. And the way it inspired it is that actually I started thinking a lot about music when I was thinking about that opera. The kind of composition that Strauss uses in Salome is called polytonality. Polytonality is when two or more tones are playing at the same time. It feels very odd. It makes you anxious. If you want to think about it, it's the theme of the Twilight Zone employs polytonality.
Okay.
And if anybody's old enough to remember what that sounds like. And so Strauss's work was criticized when he premiered Salome because it was called a cacophony, which is not true. Salome is a brilliant opera that utilizes that kind of clashing of instruments to create something very interesting. Drama is what Strauss is doing. And it got me thinking about if I could do that on the page, if I could replicate some of the feelings of the music of what Strauss is working with, but do it in a literary format. And so that's why you have as many point of views as you have in the Seventh Veil of Salome. Mm-hmm. And so I was thinking musically for this one. And that's why there's a chapter. All the chapters are names of people except for one, and that's called Son Clave. And that refers to a type of Cuban rhythm that is very important it's the foundational backbone for a lot of dances that we have. And if you get to that chapter, and if you know anything about music and about the Son Clave, you might understand why it's organized that way.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Very interesting. A music lesson too. I love that. So Candace is saying, how did you approach the research process when writing the Seventh Veil of Salome? You just said that you started looking at it in terms of music, but how did you approach how to kind of adapt Salome into this 1950s glamour Hollywood story?
Well, when I was a kid, we had Semana Santa, Holy Week. And during that week, it was all ancient world epics all the time. So they would play the Ten Commandments. They would play Cleopatra, all 3 or whatever, 4 hours of Cleopatra that it is. All these Ben-Hur, El Marco del Calvario, everything religious like that. And so it was a feast for the Technicolor senses, basically. I remember that being one of the things. And so when I was thinking about what I was going to do with Salome, how I'm going to do a biblical epic, and I'm going to do this very interesting character because Salome is an incredibly minor figure in the Bible, but she is a recurring figure in art and a conflictive figure in art. And I was thinking, how do you tackle somebody like Salome, who is basically a mythical woman? I thought, well, you have to go to the place where women were made into myths, in the time period when women were made into myths, the Marilyn Monroes of the world that we still remember and talk about. So that's 1950s Hollywood. And to me, 1950s Hollywood, I thought, well, it's perfect. Not only is the studio system at work, not only are we fabricating mythology in that time period, but it's the era of when instead of having a Marvel movie as the event of the year or of the summer, you have these ancient time epics. You have Samson and Delilah. And so it seemed the perfect world, the perfect way to look at this character from the Bible through the lens of Hollywood. So many people that I've talked about, a lot of them tell me, well, I didn't know who Salome was and had never heard of Salome. But the people who have told me I do know who Salome is, funnily enough, a lot of people don't tell me it's from Sunday school or it's from because I read the Bible. A lot of them tell me, oh, like, yeah, I know the type of film that you're talking about. I've seen this kind of stuff, right? They might not, know the character from kind of the biblical perspective, but they know it somehow through the art, either through Oscar Wilde, or they've seen a picture of it, or they've heard about some kind of Bible movie, or they've seen a little bit of it that ties to this time period, to this kind of person. So it's just fascinating how our understanding of the world is mediated through the lens of art, and especially of cinema.
Yeah, absolutely. I was introduced to Salome in college when I interned in the costumes department at a repertory opera. They were doing Salome, and I found the operatic story to be so captivating, and I kind of felt like you captured that character development of Salome very well. I really enjoyed it. Okay, so Andrew is saying, and I don't think this is too much of a spoiler because I don't want to spoil it for anyone, but Andrew from Shrewsbury Public Library is saying, in the Seventh Veil of Salome, is the narration of the story of Salome intended to be giving the movie script version or a flashback to the actual events?
It's open to interpretation, what it is, but if you read Joe's closing chapter, I think it gives, well, yeah, I don't want to spoil it, but yeah, I think if you read Joe's last chapter and his opening chapter, it'll help answer that question. That's the way I'll put it.
Okay, yeah. So I know you've spoken in other interviews about moving from Mexico to Canada. So did your own immigration experience influence your development of Vera and her going from Mexico to Hollywood?
Somewhat in the sense that there are like a couple of experiences and slurs that I had said about me when I immigrated, not in the particulars. And a lot of my experience was very, very different, decades removed, and I'm not an actress at all. But I think, two small incidents that happened to me. But in general, it was more the feeling of when you're an immigrant, at least in my case, when I was in Mexico, it was coming from a society where we're all kind of the same. It was like a mono society. And going from that feeling that, everybody is like me, more or less, to going to another country and suddenly you become the other. Suddenly you're like, oh, I'm not like every other people. I'm different from everybody else. And how that can sometimes lead to some interesting and sometimes negative experiences. Yeah, a little bit of that. But my path was obviously not the same as a starlet that is plucked from obscurity to fame. But yeah, it's just like that. It's a very strange feeling when you go from being like, oh, like I'm just one of everybody, and then, oh no, you're one of the other. I don't think I've ever had that happen quite like that ever again, except maybe when I went to Japan, and I stood out again in a completely different way than I stand out in Canada, but standing out in Japan. Although that was a completely positive experience. I loved it, and Japanese people were very nice, and they did not make fun of my Japanese, and it was a very wonderful experience. But yeah, the actual Canada, the US, that kind of stuff. Yeah, that was the first time where I was suddenly thrust into a role that I had never played before.
Alyssa is saying, so kind of like Vera's parents, or maybe not like Vera's parents, how have your parents and family best supported and encouraged you, especially when you first got started?
Well, my parents always had books around the house. My mother used to read a lot of horror, and she watched a lot of horror films. She let me read and watch it. That was not a big deal. and there were always books around the house. And that was not the case for everybody in my socioeconomic strata. We were, my parents were journalists, so our means of acquisition varied a lot from time to time. Sometimes there was a bit more money, and sometimes there was no money at all. And but we were, kind of like middle class, lower middle class, depending. It kind of went up and a little down. But we, being journalists, culture was a big thing, and literature was a big thing, and movies and art and all that kind of stuff. Some of my classmates, even people who had more money than me, a lot more resources and opportunities, you went to their houses and they didn't have a single book. You walk through these beautiful spaces, but it's like not a single book in sight. And so I grew up with a lot of that cultural kind of richness that in my repertoire, and that was very, very helpful, as opposed to coming to it as this is something completely new and alien, which I know happened to some other people that I know that, there was none of that. And then maybe they went off to university or something. They moved out and, oh my God, there's this world of stuff I've never experienced before. I knew there was this stuff. And so that was very, very useful. And yeah, I mean, that's about it in terms of my parents. They never said don't write. They never said write. It wasn't like, it was kind of like whatever. My husband, he's my first reader, Stephen King's first reader. He's talked about it. It's his wife, Tabitha. He says you have to have a first reader, the one person that you trust with your stuff, that understands your work and is going to give valuable feedback. And for me, that has always been my husband. I used to give him the short stories when I was writing them. I would write one and I would give it to him, and he would read it as he was commuting to work on the subway. And so I would do that regularly. I would give him a story. He would read it. He would tell me what he thought about it in the morning. So a lot of stories to read, a lot of chapters. And so he's always been kind of very positive about my writing. My children don't read what I write. It's really funny because one of them tried reading something of mine recently and started reading it, said, I don't like it. And I said, stop reading it. I said, just read something else. You don't have to, right? Like force yourself to do something that you don't want to do. And so I said, don't, like, I said, he was like, I don't like it. I was like, it's fine, right? But my husband does like it. He really likes my writing. And so he's always been my first reader.
That's excellent. I feel like I would be shy because it's very vulnerable, but I guess at this point you're used to handing it over and letting him be the first reader. We have a lot of people commenting about the playlists in the back of your books, and especially the Seventh Veil of Salome playlist. And Patricia from Arizona State University is saying, I love how you include playlists at the back of your books. What role does music play in your writing? I mean,
varies a lot by the work. Yeah. So in Salome, big because I was listening to a lot of opera actually. And then because one of the characters is a jazz pianist, I was also listening to a lot of jazz and thinking about music at the same time. It's not just the act of listening, but thinking about how you do things with music, how you don't do things with music. So intellectually very involved with music. Signal to Noise, which is my debut novel, is about some teenagers who figure out how to cast spells using vinyl records in the 1980s. So there was a lot of music in that, in the sense that it's like, what things was I going to reference, what things they were going to like and that they were going to talk about in terms of musicality. So there was that one. And the other ones, it's, like Velvet Was a Night also has a couple of characters who really like music in 1971 in Mexico City. And that one was important because of the issue of censorship. So American music in the late 60s in Mexico was considered un-Mexican or kind of like bad to listen to. The Mexican government was very repressive at the time period, and they closed the live music venues. So you couldn't, there used to be something called singing cafes where you used to go listen to music and all that kind of stuff. So they closed those down. because there were a lot of student protests and a big kind of youth movement asking for more rights, for freedom of this, for freedom of that. And so they found music threatening. And they especially were very much against like American music in English. Um, and so rock music was coming into Mexican society, and it was a threat to society. And so knowing about some of that music, some of the way rock begins to emerge in Mexico, I have two characters who really kind of like this music, and one of them is an enforcer for the government. So he's actually doing something that is considered kind of like not so good. And so music plays a role in that to show us how these characters kind of don't belong in society. They're misfits, and their affection for these different types of music reflects part of their personality and their character. So that is another novel in which music has an important component for the actual narrative of the story.
Mm-hmm. Well, and you can ask the same question of film, which is also very prevalent in Salome, of course, but in Silver Nitrate, even kind of the sound editing and in the 90s film industry in Mexico City. So there are numerous film references and like your passion for film woven within your novels as well.
Yeah, I'm a huge film buff, and like old films. The stuff that I watch is I subscribe to the Criterion channel, and so I like watching old films. I, there's the last DVD rental place in Vancouver, and I go to it, right? And I go to the movie theater, which a lot of people don't like to do anymore. They like to stream it. I like to go to the movie theater. And so film has always been a huge part of my life, a huge influence, and it seeps into certain narratives more explicitly, like Silver Nitrate, that is about the film industry and the horror industry specifically, and more subtly in other works where maybe it's not the main thrust of the story, but maybe there's something interesting about the way something was constructed in film that I'm thinking about.
Mm-hmm. Monica from Reading Public Library says, "Hi, Sylvia, huge fangirl here. As a librarian, people always ask me, what are you reading? I've mentioned your books to several people. Although I'm always thrilled when someone takes my reading suggestions, I've also been frustrated by the reactions some people have. It seems that your books really challenge some people's stereotypes about Mexico and Mexicans. Have you experienced this as well? How do you feel about it? Is this something that you set out to do in your writing?"
Yeah, I think two of the funny ones that I've gotten was like somebody told me that in Mexican Gothic, it's about this British family that is living in Mexico, and they used to have mines, and somebody told me, oh, why did you do this thing like with British people in Mexico? There were like no British people in Mexico. It was only Spaniards. And I kind of laughed because Mexican Gothic is inspired by a town called Real del Monte, and its nickname is Little Cornwall. Oh. There were a lot of British immigrants there that were mining silver. I was inspired for that novel partially by the history of Hidalgo, the mining history in Mexico, and the kind of mineral exploitation that happened. And yes, the Spaniards came first, but then we had this big wave of kind of British mining. And the house in Mexican Gothic, one of the houses that was the inspiration for that house was a house in Mexico City that was called, it doesn't exist anymore, the Brandt Rickard House. And it was from this British magnate. I think he was involved with trains in the turn of the century in Mexico. And it looks like the Monsters house. Or the Addams Family, have you ever seen the Addams Family or the Monsters house, that very kind of Victorian sort of structure? It looks just like that. And so, yeah, when people were telling me like, this would never happen, you would never have like a British house in the middle of Mexico, and it's cold in the novel, and I'm like, yeah, because the town is Real del Monte, it's up high in the mountains, it rains, it's cold, it's foggy, I've been there, and so I think, people had this idea of Mexico being a desert and being all kind of like cacti, and that's
Oh,
kind of it. And so then you tell them, well, yeah, but we actually have a varied topography. I mean, I don't know what's going to happen with climate change, but I can tell you that Real del Monte used to be pretty chilly up there. Not snow, but water and fog, definitely. So that's one where somebody told me that. So, um, and the other one, I guess, is just like people wanting certain markers of, I guess, of the exotic in order to accept something as um, as this label of authenticity, right? And so sometimes people will say things like, "Oh, um, why isn't there um, more Spanish in your books?" Right?
hmm.
And I think, like, because it's written in English, I'm writing it in English, and so people are, you have to assume that they're writing in Spanish, but it's written for an English speaking audience. And it's very funny because you don't see people ask for that when it's kind of other ethnicities. Like, I've never heard anybody say, "Oh, Madame Bovary, uh, there was not enough French in my copy of Madame Bovary," right? Not enough French words. And you don't read Madame Bovary, and I mean, if you read it in translation, it doesn't say, "I ate a croissant and then I looked out la fenêtre and I
Yeah.
said, Mon Dieu," as I turned to my friend, "Mon ami, comment tu t'appelles?" I asked, "What is your name?" Like, that's not how you read, you know, Madame Bovary, but there is that expectation of, like, well, that's how you must read kind of anything that's Latin American fiction. It needs to be peppered with Spanish, with words in Spanish. Um, but then when you do include the words in Spanish, which sometimes I do, because sometimes there's words that are not translatable, and sometimes there might be Mayan words or Nahua words that I might be using in a certain story. So if I can't find a translation, a direct translation, I might use a word in Spanish and context clues for you to be able to figure out what I'm talking about. But I've had people tell me, like, when I do that, when it's like, "Oh, okay, well, here's the word in Spanish. All right, you wanted it, here it is." And then people will come and say sometimes, like, there were too many words in Spanish, I didn't understand it, or the names were weird. That's one of the funniest, when somebody told me, "Oh, I couldn't get into the book because the names were weird." Right? I mean, for me, like, Carlos is, it's a very common name,
Yeah.
and Tiffany is extremely exotic. I never know how many F's and how many N's that name has, but it's a question of perspective. But so so you want me to call a character Charles, and it's okay if he says enchilada, but if he says mazateco, then we're not in business, kind of situation. And yeah, I think that's because there's a certain threshold of acceptability of the exotic. You're allowed to be like this percentage of, like, Latino in this way. So
Hmm.
if you wear a big hat like Speedy Gonzalez, very good, very authentic. But if you do the equivalent of basically not wearing that hat and you're wearing, I don't know, a bowler hat, it's like, no, that's not okay. Even though my grandfather wore something that looked like a bowler hat in early 1900s, because look up graffiti in Mexico and look like what people dressed like in that time period. And in 1910, look up Mexico, what it dressed like in 1910, in the city, not in the countryside maybe, but in the city for sure. So I do think that happens because, unfortunately, we have a very narrow pool to draw from. What do we consider to be, what do we know as Latin American literature? And most people will know maybe one or two books tops. 100 Years of Solitude. Everybody always tells me, like, 100 Years of Solitude. Have you read that? Well, that's like asking, have you heard of William Shakespeare, right?
Yeah.
And then there's a whole other body of literature. So when your context is like, when you're seeing only like this much of literature, of course you're going to come to it with a lot of wrong ideas and wrong assumptions. And there's nothing, that's okay. There's a lot of things that when I started reading it, I knew this much about this genre or this part of the world, Korea, my God, I started reading Korean thrillers. I didn't know anything about it, not even find it on a map kind of situation. I'll be honest with you. But I read more and I learned more about Korean society and a lot more now about Korean crime thrillers. But I came to it with an honest and open mind, telling myself, I don't know anything about this.
Yeah.
So I'm coming from zero to read this kind of literature. I'm going to be open. The problem is when you've only read like this much, like I said, you only know this sliver about something, but you come with blinders and a closed mind and you're like, nope, I will not accept anything else. If people are not speaking 25% of the time in Spanish in the book, it is bad. If they're not wearing big hats, it is bad. And so that's a problem. And because that perpetuates exoticism and it perpetuates the syndrome of a single story, where we only have one story to tell about these people, this part of the world. And so that means that's how Gabriel Garcia Marquez is the only Latin American author you will ever read or know about. Is when you do that, it becomes a vicious circle. So you kind of gotta, if you step out of that, if you go, I think, with an open mind and an open frame into Latin American literature and Latino literature in general, like second generation, Hispanic, Latino, Latinx, whatever you want to call it, experiences and perspectives, you will have a much more enriching time than if you just go like, nope, Latin American literature is only this, and this is the only thing, like nothing else. That is it. If they don't have big hats, I'm out of here, kind of situation.
The point of
but that does happen. That people kind of like, nope, this is it.
Yeah, I unfortunately believe that. The point of literature, though, being that you want to learn, you want to expand your mind. It transports you to a new place. So it's a conundrum. Susan from Thousand Oaks Library is saying a number of Latin American women writers are currently publishing novels and short stories that explore violence, misogyny, and poverty in their respective countries. Just to cite two examples, Mariana Enriquez from Argentina has gained popularity for her works that are anchored with genres of horror and fantasy. The Mexican Fernanda Melchor writes novels that denounce sexual terrorism and misogynistic myths. Given your own interest in fantasy, horror, noir, and history, how do you explain this trend, or can you, about Latin American women writers?
Yeah, I've read several pieces about this. I think it's just one is that unfortunately Latin America has been associated with magic realism for such a really long time that to English language speakers that's the only thing that existed, and it was like there's nothing else, like nothing else is occurring in this space. But that was like I mean, magic realism really the heyday of that was like 60 years ago, more or less, 50, 60 years ago. That's like thinking that the latest and greatest in film is, I don't know, The Godfather, kind of even older than that.
Yeah.
A lot of things have happened since The Godfather. And in a way, what in English language spaces, what took place was because of that desire to associate Latin American fiction only with magic realism, they missed a lot of literature that happened in the decades that happened afterwards. And one of the interesting things that began to happen in the decades afterwards, maybe 10 years ago, more or less, in Latin America, was this move towards several women writing what I would call dark literature, dark fiction. Some of it with explicit kind of supernatural elements, and some with some softer speculative elements. And so you start seeing several of them doing that. literature that wasn't in the mold of magic realism and was also not in the mold of what a lot of maybe their popular male colleagues had been doing for a while in Latin America, kind of carving out this space. And people didn't seem to notice for a while that this was happening. And then 2 3 years ago, boom, like suddenly people saw for the first time somebody like Mariana Enriquez or Samantha Schwebling, these kinds of writers who have been working, actually, I think Mariana, since I'm going to say since the 1990s.
Mm.
Some of the early stuff she did was not similar to what she does now. And again, that's because of the sliver of the only thing we could see was like this part, and we kind of did not see this whole other thing that's happening in this other space, and that is responding to a lot of modern anxieties of women, which are not maybe the same anxieties that people had in the 1960s in Latin America with magical realism, where you were living under a junta, and that was your reality of that time period. Now people like Mariana Enriquez are writing about trauma. What is it like to be the child of somebody who disappeared in the 60s? El hijo de uno de los desaparecidos. What is it like, that feeling? What is it like to be in a nation that was torn apart decades before, where some people went into your house, shot somebody in your family, and because your neighbor gave them a tip about something? What is it like to live in a country where globalism and capitalism has created an untenable situation where you're really, really badly off economically? So all of these women are kind of talking about those things that are important and interesting to them nowadays. And yes, I've noticed it a lot more, this kind of dark fiction. But it's amazing that people are finally kind of seeing this sort of uh, dark space that before was kind of kept hidden away and would not have been noticed. Now it's starting to be noticed, and things like ecological concerns too in novels such as Pink Slime, queer concerns in novels such as Monstrillo. This is all stuff that in the 1980s it would not have been published.
Mhm.
Simply in the English language, it would not have been translated because it would not have been deemed kind of like the kind of literature that comes out of Latin America.
Mm-hmm. On that note, Jose from Palm Desert Library is saying, do you think that momentum for Latino authors within the publishing industry has slowed down after what felt like a wave of 2 or 3 years ago? And Pamela, I think it was Pamela, was wondering if that momentum was because of the American Dirt controversy.
Yes, I do think. I mean, it's slowed down also for African American authors, and part of that momentum was because of several tragedies that happened of Black people being killed, being murdered in the United States, and several calls to action from publishers to, oh, now we're going to publish this book that analyzes racism, blah blah blah. And Latin American writers have a similar thing with the American Dirt controversy, where there was a pledge to, oh, we're going to support now Latino writers, we're going to do this, we're going to do that, and then nothing happened. So it was a very brief period of, I think, optimism, like maybe less than 2 years, and then the reality came crashing down of like, no. I mean, the only good thing that happened during that time period that I can say is that a few people that I know got signed on to some good contracts. I hope they got paid well.
Mm-hmm.
But long term, structurally, nothing changed. And we actually now have less. In the last survey that I looked, that looks at the publishing industry, the number of people working in publishing with a Hispanic or Latino background actually has gone down.
Oh.
In this past year, the survey. So we have lost people in the editorial department and these kinds of publishing houses who are able to kind of push through some of these conversations. And so that's sadly the place where we are right now. Is probably, maybe even worse off than we were 3-4 years ago.
Mm-hmm. That's a sad state of affairs.
Yes.
Audi from Long Beach Public Library and I'm told this was translated from Spanish, is saying, what is the biggest challenge when writing about Mexico and its culture for an international audience? But I think that that's probably what you've been talking about with the sliver. Do you have a big, what's the biggest challenge, I guess, for you and not the audience and not writers as a whole?
I mean, I kind of write what I want to write, but there are certain market realities that I have to kind of face or understand or be aware of. I'm ultimately not going to write what I want to, but I am aware that I could probably be a lot more successful and make a lot more money if I wrote something like American Dirt. If I kowtowed and just put all the stereotypes in there and embrace that, and that I could probably make money like a bandit, but I'm not. I'm not going to. I think you just have to be aware of what kind of writer you have to be, and be true to that, no matter what the market says. And at the same time, you have to be realistic. I mean, I am realistic in the sense that, I mean, I don't know. I'm under contract right now. And when that contract ends, we'll see what happens, because I became a full-time freelance writer 2 years ago. I kind of quit my job, left my pension plan behind. Now I'm a freelance writer for now. I've got a contract. I'm on contract for 3 more books. So 3 more years of books. And after that, I will evaluate what it's looking like financially. Can I do this? I am the breadwinner in the family, the main income earner, and can I stay like this as a full-time freelancer, or can I not? Do I have to go back to corporate communications to do that kind of work? Can I maybe do it part-time? Can I open a business? I have a fantasy of opening a bookstore. We shall see. So I like to be realistic about the world that I live in, but I also, if I was doing something that I don't like, that wouldn't be worth it. It really would be, better to pack up my things and say no more writing. Let's do something else, than to write something that I completely and absolutely hate.
Yeah, I hear that. Okay, so Maria from Sonoma County Library is saying there's a lot of writing advice out there. Some good, some not as much. What's a writing rule or piece of advice you strongly disagree with, and why?
I mean,
it's so different.
I don't know. I'm very flexible, right? I'm very flexible. There's stuff that works sometimes. There's stuff that doesn't work sometimes. I love third person point of view. It's my favorite point of view. I hate first person. And I've had people tell me, no, like it has to be first person. That's how you get the readers. It's what they want. It's more immersive. And I'm like, no, I am not going to do first person in a novel kind of situation. And yet, I have been thinking with the Western that maybe what I need to do is first person for that one. So even I betray myself at times. I just think it depends a lot on the context. But I like to read a lot of other writers talking about their stuff and seeing what they say, what they consider to be their golden rules, what they won't do. And one of my favorite books is Stephen King's On Writing. Mm-hmm. Half of it is about his life, and the other half is about how do you write a book, how do you write a novel. And I just love it. I don't think what Stephen King does maybe would work for me all the time, or even some of the time, but I love hearing him talk in that book about what does work, how he does kind of make it happen.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's inspirational to read what other people are doing, especially if you haven't found your own footing yet. So it's like different things that you can try or not try. And I will say, I feel like first person point of view, the books are so much longer. in first person point of view for some reason. Interesting. Well, I can't wait to see what you do with the Western. I'm still hanging on that. Alma is saying, not a question, but as a fellow Latina, please keep doing what you're doing. We need more badass women from our community like you. That's nice. Deshana is asking, after finishing a novel, what do you do to reset and recharge? It seems like you publish so quickly. You're just always in writing mode.
Yeah, especially now that it's a full-time job, I gotta eat, right? And there's not a specific thing that I do when I go from one project to another. What often just happens is that I'm done with the thing, and something else has already been boring in my brain and wants to be born. So I'm just like, let's finish this because there's something else that I'm interested in. So it's just like boom, boom, from one thing to the other. I'm not the kind of person who's like, I take a 3-week retreat kind of situation.
Okay.
Because I'm obsessive compulsive. So once the compulsion sets in, I gotta do it. So I'm lucky sometimes if I get a couple of days without some nervous tick taking me into research or a new project.
Christina from Tallahassee, Florida is saying, it's probably impossible to choose, but what is your favorite story that you've ever created?
Like short story or like novel? Because novel, I'm very partial to my least known novel, which is called Untamed Shore, because that's from the place where I was born, and it's set in Baja California, and I love Baja California, and it's a lot about the land and the landscapes, this novel. But short stories, yeah, they're all my babies. There was one story that I wrote, and it was in a queer Poe anthology, and it's a kind of like a take on Ligeia, and I really like that one, and it hasn't been reprinted. But that one was a favorite for a really long time, just because I really liked Poe. And so when this editor approached me and was like, "Hey, you want to be in a Poe anthology, and it's a queer Poe anthology," I was like, "Do I ever want to?" But it hasn't been reprinted, I think. I'm gonna look it up. No, I don't think. Yeah,
we all want to know.
It's called Variations of Figures Upon the Wall. And it appeared in Where Thy Dark Eye Glances, querying Poe, back in 2013, all along. It was republished in Pseudopod, which was an audio magazine. I don't know if it still exists, but it was published in audio form for free in Pseudopod years and years ago. But yeah, I have a lot of obscure short stories that got published once and then will never resurface anywhere again. And but that one is probably one of the lost stories that I really like the most. So Variations of Figures Upon the Wall.
Oh, great. Thank you. I know everybody's writing that down. I do want to ask one question before I get to the very last question, because it's come up a couple of times. But I'll ask Annie's question. Annie says, my sister loves your books. She wasn't able to make it, but she wants to know, how in the world did you come up with mind-controlling fungi? I mean, I have an idea of how you might have come up with that, but I think that they're referring to Mexican Gothic.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah. I like mushrooms. I think one of the happiest days of my life was one time when I found a huge patch of amanita mushrooms near my house. Well, it was really big. They're like the red mushrooms with the white spots. They're poisonous. Okay. You shouldn't eat them. They look beautiful though, but that was like super exciting. It was so big. And so I really like mushrooms, and I know about them, about what they do. And I came up with that knowing about the biology of fungi, and how sometimes fungi, some species can change the behavior of certain species. And cicadas, which are mentioned in the novel, are one of the things that I was thinking about, how the fungus infects the cicada, and it basically turns it into a sex zombie. The cicada has this desperate drive to mate so it can spread its spores. So it's being controlled by basically the mushroom. to
Wow.
make it mate and spread its spores. It's disgusting because sometimes you see them and like half of them is already missing, like the abdomen has been eaten by the fungus and they're still trying to mate and spread this thing, and then they die and their corpses, the fluids drip down through the branches or whatever, and they infect other cicadas. It's horrible. It's awful. Like
Oh, wow. It's like a horror.
nature is nature is disturbing. When Darwin, one of the problems Darwin had was that when he observed certain kinds of parasitism, he started doubting the existence of God. This is true, absolutely, by the way. And I, knowing some of the things I know about biology, have asked myself, yes, about a creator and why a creator would do certain things. And definitely cicadas and fungi are one of the things that will make you question the
Wow.
existence of God, a whole theological kind of buffet to be explored there.
Well, I'm so happy that I paused to ask that question. That was so interesting. Thank you. So just to close, we always like to ask, and Heather from Marion Public Library is asking right now, what are you reading right now that everybody should run out to the library and check out immediately?
So there's this very, very small press book. So I don't know if the library will have it, but you should ask them to have it. It's called The Nightmare Box and Other Stories by Cynthia Gomez. It's this kind of weird, like if you like the Twilight Zone kind of weirdness in an urban environment with a lot of Latino characters and queer characters and working class characters. Really very interesting. Very small press. I don't even know how I came upon this book. I think somebody that I know was talking about it. And I loved it. I thought she's great. She's gonna be big one day. And then the other one was that there's this author called Michael McDowell, and he has this saga called Blackwater, the complete saga, and it's perfect for October, for Halloween. I had read Michael McDowell's some of his other books. I read The Elementals, which is a classic of haunted house story, but Blackwater is set in 1919, and it's kind of like a Southern Gothic. It's a really long book because if you get the edition that came out a few years ago with who are they? Well, the edition that I got, which is the one that is available nowadays, with Valancourt Books. If you get that, Blackwater was actually, I think, 6 books all put together. And so the edition that you can find online now as an ebook, it collects all of them. So it's really long.
Okay.
About 700 pages long, but like beautiful Southern Gothic saga, like about this family. And Michael McDowell, aside from writing Cold Moon Over Babylon, aside from writing The Elementals, he wrote the script for Beetlejuice. So I think that is a perfect rec for Halloween time. And also, like I said, Cynthia Gomez, The Nightmare Box and Other Stories. If you don't like really long, because I gave you just really chunky with Michael, like 700 pages of Gothic, if you're like, I cannot live through that, Cynthia Gomez, slim little collection, read a short story, 5 pages, we're done. Boom, read another story another day, boom, you're done. So you've got both options.
Best of both worlds. That's right. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. It's truly been a pleasure to talk to you for the last hour. So thank you, truly.
No, thank you.
I also want to extend a huge thank you to all of our viewers for tuning in. Without your support, none of this would be possible. So we thank you for choosing to spend your time with us. If you scroll down below the live stream video, you can see the resources area, which contains a link to Silvia's book, The Seventh Veil of Salome. We look forward to seeing you all again on October 22nd when we chat with New York Times bestselling author and psychotherapist Lori Gottlieb. I am Brandon Adler, and thank you everybody so much for joining us.